Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Resolved, Uniting Nations in a Divided World by Ban Ki-moon, narrated by David Shih. I, Ban Ki-moon, solemnly swear to exercise in all loyalty, discretion, and conscience the functions entrusted to me as Secretary-General of the United Nations, to discharge these functions and regulate my conduct with the interests of the UN only in view, and not to seek or accept instructions in regard to the performance of my duties from any government or other authority external to the organization. Ban Ki-moon, December 14, 2006. Preface. War and peace. These are the guiding words of the United Nations, and also the defining experiences of my formative years. War. The Korean War broke out in 1950 when I was just 6 years old. Peace. The United Nations was our savior, bringing peace to a divided nation. The images of bombs raining down on my village will forever be seared in my memory. But so is the sight of the United Nations flag flying high, signaling that we were not alone. As long as that blue banner waved, we would be safe. I will never forget the hope that this flag engendered decades before I came to head the United Nations and serve the organization that saved me and my country from ruin. My devotion to the United Nations was reinforced when I was just 12 years old. I sent a letter on behalf of my classmates to then Secretary-General Dag Hammarskjöld, urging him to help the young people in Hungary who were fighting for freedom from the Soviet Union. I could never have predicted that the young boy who sent this appeal to the UN Secretary-General would, 50 years later, walk in his shoes. Having grown up surviving on UNICEF provisions and learning from UNESCO textbooks in the rubble of war, I can think of no greater honor than the privilege of serving as the United Nations Secretary-General. When I was elected in October 2006, I pledged to exert my best efforts to create a better world for all people. I leave it to future historians to judge my efforts, but I take comfort in the knowledge that I have done everything I could to be a voice for the voiceless and a defender for the defenseless. I was one of them, and I know from experience that international solidarity is a matter of life and death. It saved my country, and I will never stop believing that it can save our world. Even today, we hear the cries of many millions of refugees, the painful images of boys and girls helplessly seeking assistance, the plight of widows struggling against oppression to find a bit of food for their children. All this suffering still keeps me awake at night. That is why I keep pointing out the urgent need for world leaders' political will, along with a readiness to partner with others. And I continue to stress that this effort must be guided by an enhanced sense of our common humanity, rather than a belief in barriers and barbed wire. Today, I am more concerned than ever about the divisions among countries, the dangerous rhetoric of hate spewing from some world leaders, and the threats to multilateralism. Some countries are balking at their commitments under UN-sponsored accords, such as the Paris Climate Agreement, while others struggle with human rights. As Secretary-General, I was in constant contact with political, business, and civil society leaders, around the clock and around the world. I was guided by my strong conviction that open-minded and compassionate approaches with those concerned would help me steer through the turbulence of international politics. I tried to show respect and humility in my dealings with counterparts. Unfortunately, this was sometimes misunderstood as weakness. My guiding approach was to be flexible, but strong like water, which can flow steadily around obstacles at times and have a fierce impact at other times. I believe that speaking is a revelation of knowledge, and listening is a source of wisdom. One of the greatest sources of conflict in today's world is the lack of understanding and appreciation among different cultures, countries, and regions. Many others will judge my tenure, but I am proud that 2015 will go down in history As the year the United Nations delivered two of the most ambitious visions for the world's people, the Paris Climate Agreement and the 2030 Agenda with 17 Sustainable Development Goals. On those two occasions, I heard the thunderous applause of world leaders inspired by their unity in the face of major threats facing humanity. Those standing ovations were proof that leaders at odds with one another can transcend their differences for the greater good. I hoped that the sense of unity embodied by those two moments could last forever. But 5 years later, it's clear that we need to redouble our efforts with input from businesses, civil society, and ordinary citizens to make progress on both goals. I watched in sadness as the global recession and the coronavirus reversed much of our progress against poverty. Every region of the world is suffering from the irrefutable evidence of the climate crisis, yet we are not slashing carbon emissions with an urgency equal to the threat. In addition to achieving these two landmark goals, I devoted my time and energy to empowering women and young people. The creation of UN Women was hailed as an important reform. My commitment to public service in Korea naturally grew into a commitment to public service for our world. I could never express how much I owe to so many people around the world for extending to me and all Koreans their strong, unconditional support and friendship. During the difficult moments when I faced complex crises, their voices have been a source of energy, boosting my own limited capacity. I hope people around the world will make the most of their own capacities, focusing on small improvements and concrete long-term gains. Civic engagement is the future of our shared lives. We need the environment to sustain us, health to strengthen us, peace to inspire us, and the future to motivate us. I say us because we cannot attain these universal conditions working alone. This book is not chronological, nor does it cover all that I experienced during my tenure. That would be impossible in this restricted space and time. It is informed by my personal perspective, which is naturally limited. Countless stories of selfless devotion by the tens of thousands of staff and peacekeepers also deserve to be told. Part 1. A Child of War, a Man of Peace. The Foundations of a Diplomatic Life. Chapter 1. Early Life, From Tragedy to Strength. I was a child of war, but I became a man of peace. My journey began in Korea. I was born in 1944 in humble Umsung County, known for producing the fiery red chili peppers, gochu, that are inseparable from Korean cuisine. At that time, the Allies were liberating Western Europe in some of World War II's bloodiest battles. But that was far away, and my young parents were focusing on making a living and starting a family. When I was still too young to talk, we moved to the city of Cheongju, where my father worked for an agricultural firm. Just 2 weeks after my 6th birthday, soldiers from the communist north invaded the south, sparking the Korean War. Some days we could hear the fighting in the distance. There was little doubt that North Korean soldiers were approaching, and with them, destruction. I don't know how I knew this because my parents were careful not to show fear around me, but they could only protect my brother and me so far. We were living in a crucible of fear. After 6 months of anxious torment, the war abruptly changed, and invading forces came barreling toward us. More than 500,000 Chinese soldiers joined with the Northern Army in early January 1951, pushing down the Allied forces with brutal strength. It didn't take long for my parents to sift through our belongings and join the exodus from Cheongju. My mother, 9 months pregnant, moved slowly and heavily as our neighbors raced past us in their exodus. My father, worried and ashen with fear, took food for the journey, clothes, and some things my mother would need after the birth. And I, only 6 years old, carried what I could and struggled to keep up as we trotted over the ground. Tears welled up, but I tried to be brave. Our sacks felt heavy, even though we left almost everything behind. Racing into labor. Even before the war, giving birth was one of the most dangerous things a woman could do. The sanitary system wasn't good, and most parts of Korea lacked hospitals. Midwives were experienced in birth, but had no medical training. Families could only light some incense or offer a prayer and hope that nothing would go wrong. We were on the roadside when my mother went into labor, and we hurried to the nearest house we could see. Fortunately, the family took us in, and my mother was attended to in one of the bedrooms. I had never heard screaming like that. Each cry so loud and long and unrestrained. Her sounds pierced me to the bone. It was absolutely terrifying, and I cried so hard the tears chapped my cheeks. I understood she was in pain. I knew it had to do with the baby, and I knew her pain was very serious by the way my father held his face in his hands. I had never seen him so still, yet his shoulders shuddered every little while. When he turned to me, urging me to stop sobbing, his face looked so pale and drawn that it frightened me all the more. My brother, Kisang, only 4 years old, cried as hard as I did. My sister, Ban Jongran, was born January 6, 1951, during the chaos of the infamous January 4th retreat, when the Chinese army forced UN and South Korean forces below the 38th parallel. My mother was pale and wobbly, exhausted by her labor, but just 3 days after the delivery, she marched on with the new baby clutched tightly in her arms. Jongran was swaddled in our extra clothing and cried whenever she was not sleeping. At the time, childbirth was dangerous for both mother and baby. My legal birth date is June 13, 1944, but I was actually born 1 month earlier. My parents, as so many others, waited to register my birth until they were sure I would survive. As we were walking, I was terribly curious about this tiny child, who was even smaller and more helpless than I felt. I knew I had to be even braver now that my sister had arrived. We walked as quickly as my mother could go, stopping frequently to rest. Safety was just 15 miles away, but we traveled on foot, a journey that would take 2 days. I wore thin rubber shoes that did not protect me from rocks, brambles, or even the mud that covered the rough paths we hurried along. With bloody feet, little food, and constant walking, followed by an exhausted but shallow sleep, I was miserable. Having my parents so close was reassuring, but I was too frightened and cold to sleep. Decades later, I felt the same terror whenever I visited refugee camps. Hundreds of thousands of refugees born in sometimes massive camps grew up knowing nothing but life in tents. Most of these refugees lived in dry, dusty regions, not the frigid Korean peninsula. But, like mine, their lives were upended by the political and economic forces that drive people and nations to war. Many of these families have experienced the savagery and poverty that has now forced more than 30 million people from their homes. For these refugee children, the boundary of the camp represented the end of their world. A child of war. My maternal grandparents lived on a mountainside at the edge of a forest, a safe place to wait out one of the most vicious conflicts of the 20th century. Kisang and I watched as fighter jets strafed the towns and villages we had walked through. We cried in fear, even though the bombardment was far away. We stayed in my grandparents' small house in Jungpyeong for a few months, but it felt so much longer. We passed the time mostly by searching for food, and for respite, playing with the baby. She must have felt how distressed everyone was, because she cried all the time. There were no toys or even pencils, and I was bored. I remember playing a few pranks, but there wasn't much else for me to do. We were focused on survival. My father and grandfather were running here and there, searching for food. We had just enough to eat, but rarely enough to fill our stomachs. It was poor food, potatoes and so on. We could not even buy rice. I was hungry all the time. Everyone was. We finally returned home in the spring of 1951. The fighting was still going on, and everyone, civilian and soldier, was desperate with hunger. We had been eating so little for so long that the occasional egg was a treat. Signs of war were all around us, but we quickly worked to rebuild our homes and our lives. Parts of Cheongju had been damaged during the war, but my family's home was fine. After the armistice in July 1953, the countryside again became frightening. North Korean and Chinese soldiers were withdrawing, and the mountainsides were filled with North Korean soldiers trapped below the 38th parallel. When the war was over, we moved to Cheongju, a city near Namsan Mountain. I lived there until I left to study at Seoul National University, but the rest of my family stayed, including my mother, until her death at age 100 in June 2019. No society wants children to be exposed to the horrors of war. We don't want them to grow up into adults who think such atrocities are normal. But children are always caught up in the trauma and fear of armed conflict, and so I became a man of peace. Rescued by distant nations. The United Nations enshrines the dignity of human life by protecting children first and foremost. Special protections for the youngest are included in all international human rights documents, from the bedrock text of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights through the 1990 Convention on the Rights of the Child, and beyond. The importance of the United Nations to the Korean War is hard to overstate. Simply put, the organization saved our lives and our country. The UN soldiers stopped the war. Humanitarian agencies gave us food and books. The blue and white flag, with a globe cradled by the olive branches of peace, gave us hope. The United Nations Command, UNC, consisted of more than 300,000 troops from 16 nations, with 5 more nations providing medical teams. It was a peace enforcement mission, which was conceived as a robust international military response to an armed aggression. U.S. President Harry Truman supported a muscular peace enforcement operation because the United States did not want to plan and fight a new war alone so soon after World War II. Nonetheless, U.S. troops accounted for about 90% of the foreign forces. Still, the UNC suffered heavy losses. Nearly 40,000 foreign troops died, more than 36,000 of them Americans. The first time I saw Americans was among the ranks of the UNC. Each of the 16 armies wore their national uniform, and at that age, I admit I had trouble separating the United States from the United Nations. We would shout, "Hello," to them, waiting to be showered with little trinkets and candies by the soldiers, who even tossed their rations on the side of the road as their trucks rumbled by. This is one certain way to impress a small child, but the Americans were only part of a multinational effort. I could not know the importance of the United Nations at that time, but I knew its presence meant I could harbor a small sense of hope. Certainly, it meant friends around the globe were helping us. To the world, we mattered. The United Nations gave us more than candy and toys. Schools were built to replace those damaged and destroyed by the war. The organization even tried to overcome the loss of thousands of teachers. I remember students carrying out a chalkboard every day and placing it under the trees that served as our classroom. Amid all the rubble, we sat on rocks for chairs. We brought sacks to class at the urging of teachers and carried home powdered milk donated by the UN. Food and clothing were most important, but I remember nothing as fondly as the textbooks we were given. In that barren landscape, we were introduced to reading, mathematics, and science, and to the world outside Korea. I devoured this knowledge as fervently as I did the rice bars. On the last page of each textbook was written, "This textbook was printed with generous assistance from the UN Korean Reconstruction Agency, UNCRA, and the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO." I was so deeply grateful to both, and I was very curious about UNESCO. I never dreamed that I would someday personally thank the organization for teaching that impoverished boy to read and waking him to the world outside Korea. When I initiated the Global Education First Initiative, GEFI, in September 2012, with former UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown as the UN Special Envoy, I told this story to the member states. A few weeks later, having heard my story, the Korean National Commission for UNESCO searched the old bookshops and uncovered several textbooks of the type we had used in those days, and they gave one to me in a ceremony held during a youth forum in Yeosu, Korea. It is the most treasured gift I have ever received. They also donated 2 of them to Irina Bokova, then Director General of UNESCO, who permanently display them at UNESCO's Paris headquarters. I hope that children today and in the future also see the beacon of hope that the UN represents. As we sat in those makeshift classrooms, we knew that one day we would be able to pay back the world for its assistance in our darkest hour. We would make the fastest transition in history from a nation in need to a nation able to give. This goal launched my trajectory and shaped my purpose. I vowed to become the best person I could be and to invest whatever skills or gifts I could acquire in my country. A nuclear family in the post-war world. We didn't have much money. No one did. All we had was nature. When I was young, the country was a source of wood for fires, grass for compost, and water for drinking and bathing. The water was delicious then. Cold, clear, fresh, and sweet. I'd scoop it up into my mouth, or just lower my head and drink as much as I could straight from the stream. I can clearly see the connection between these early walks through the forest and my commitment to fighting climate change more than 50 years later. We grew barley and rice for our own meals, and often had enough to sell or barter. No one could afford fertilizer, so each family used the composted grass and human waste from the outhouses in the corners of our yard. As the eldest and a boy, I had the job of cutting the logs into firewood. I was very good with an axe. Half, then half again, each log cut into 4 pieces. At first, the axe was heavy and awkward in my hands, and I didn't trust it more than I would a weapon. But soon the motions became familiar. Lift, aim, swing, and chop, over and over and over again. I grew to like the axe's heft and the sound of the wood splitting. My upper body grew muscular, and my hands, that until now had mostly held books, began to become calloused. I think I still have splinters. This was not about fitness, nor was it meditation exactly. This was for my family, for our survival. Like everyone else I knew, my family lived in poverty. All of us, parents and children, slept in one room, on the floor, as was the style in Korea. It was very close, and I sometimes ached for privacy. My parents were a source of strength. They met for the first time only on their wedding day. Weddings were arranged by matchmakers. It was very rare for young men and women to meet each other and decide to get married on their own. People used to marry early, often as young as age 15, but my father was about 20 when my parents married. Their parents decided they would make a good match, and they did indeed. They remained married until my father died 50 years later. Korean fathers are strict, but mine was a good man, soft-hearted and compassionate. My father, Ban Myung-hwan, didn't discipline us or even say anything when we were naughty. He wasn't a big talker, but my father knew right from wrong and made sure his 6 children did as well. I learned from him my love of nature and a devout belief in caring for the stranger as well as one's family. He died too early in a car accident. But my father must have been at ease, because he knew that he had passed on a strong character to his children. I have always strived to live up to his example. My father wasn't very good with money, always losing the money he lent to friends who couldn't pay him back. He just couldn't say no. He invited friends to stay with us, and they would eat and stay for a long time. He even invited one of his friends with leprosy. I had to stay with him in my bedroom for several months. I used to wash with water many times to make sure that the basin was clean and safe. I always felt uneasy and even worried about becoming infected. My mother grew very angry. "Why are we always poor?" she would yell. My mother, Shin Hyun-sun, was always sick, surely because of all her pregnancies. I was the oldest of 6 siblings, but 2 children had died even before I was born. My mother was a woman of fortitude. I am proud that I inherited her capacity for hard work, resilience, and determination. She survived unbearable circumstances to live to her 100th birthday, and, although uneducated, learned to read and write. When her headaches and heart condition became too much for her, she would lie down in dim light, and it fell to me, as the oldest male child, to take care of the family. I learned to cook rice and simple stews, but I was in high school then, and I didn't like it. I had discovered the endless worlds inside books and wanted to be with my friends. Women in the neighborhood would often help out, which gave me more time to spend with my books. In fact, they liked to come over because my mother was very popular. She was a bit of a gossip and a very good storyteller. Women would come to her when they had something personal to discuss. I rarely overheard their confidences and couldn't understand them when I did. Despite her illnesses, my mother was a vivid presence in conservative Korean society, which was heavily influenced by Confucianism. In this teaching, women are accorded little agency or independence, and I had seen from an early age how grandmothers, mothers, wives, and daughters were treated. I knew intrinsically that this was wrong. I saw how the women around me rebuilt our villages and restored our lives. Despite their second-class status, Korean women were the backbone of our country's post-war rebirth. My mother inspired me to empower women at the Korean Foreign Ministry, within the ranks of the United Nations, and, especially, through UN programs around the world. I never needed studies to tell me that all of society benefited when women were given opportunities for an education, a sewing machine, or microloans. My mother spent a lot of her time going to temple to pray for her children's good health and happiness. Korean people used to believe that a woman would dream on the night she conceived, and that dream would affect the baby's life. My mother dreamed of a large pheasant, a symbol of good luck and happiness. She tried to catch it, but the bird was already in flight. My determined mother dashed after it and caught the bird with her skirt. Pheasants, with beautifully colored feathers, symbolize diversity and creativity, fortune and happiness. People often ask her about the dream, and I heard this story many times. Everyone said it was a good, strong dream. My mother's own heartbreak in pregnancy and lack of care in childbirth has made me sensitive to the risk women take to give birth. Poverty, maternal health complications, and child mortality are universal concerns, and only a fraction of the world's countries have learned to make childbirth as safe as possible. As Secretary General, I traveled in many developing countries, particularly in Africa, and I always spoke about my mother's pain and strength. People were moved by her story, which was often so similar to their own. I found it helpful to share my memories, connect with people, and give them a sense of hope. The American Example. When the Soviet Union invaded Hungary in 1956, my life was changed again. Within days, tanks were pulled up to government buildings, and soldiers were shooting at students. My schoolmates and I were deeply affected by the assault, in which 2,500 people were killed, and 17,500 were injured. Hungary had been growing more democratic, making this a
Sample complete. Ready to continue?